Hey folks, very happy to be talking to you. Thank you so much for reading the book. Hope you all enjoyed it. This is a little bit strange for me because I've actually never recorded a video of just myself speaking off the cuff without anybody to dialogue with, so we'll see how it goes. Also didn't put a ton of prep time into this, so I'm sure I will think of a million things to say after I answer your questions. Great questions, by the way. Very, very tough questions. Some of which I just actually answered in a paper I wrote and then gave at Western University in Ontario in Canada. That was about the kind of ethics and politics of my research and my activism with COFON folks over the past 25 years. I think it should be pretty clear in the book, but I started working with these people when I was 20 years old. And now I'm 45, so it's been 25 years. And for various reasons, I made a lifelong commitment to working with them and to visiting COFON territory every year, living with families, whether I had research to do or not. Did not want to be the kind of anthropologist who comes, gets his or her data, and then never goes back, especially after we finish a thesis or get a job. But of course, all of that is dependent upon COFON people's interest in maintaining the relationship as well. So it's a relationship that matters a tremendous amount to me. I'm glad there was a question about the intimacy of my relations, because they are very intimate to me. Those are people I think about every day, interact with almost as much. I'm a ritual relative with 4 COFON families, have ritual COFON kids, materially support their education, their healthcare, and stuff like that. I don't have kids of my own, so this is as close as I'll get. And the relationship is a lifelong one. So anyways, not to get too far off on that, I'll just go to the question. So the first question I have is, how do you grapple with your role as an anthropologist in the context of destructive anthropological journalistic representation? There's a little asterisk next to that. I don't know what that means, but my relationship with journalists is an interesting one. I think it's pretty clear in the book that I feel like the COFON have been portrayed as this totally defeated people. And I don't think that's the case. And I think it fits into Western stereotypes about who Indigenous people are, what culture is, how it changes, the resilience of people like this. And I don't think it serves anybody's purpose to just have these people kind of in the global arena as a symbol of how oil destroys human and non-human life. So in terms of interacting with journalists, I write in a somewhat accessible manner, which I hopefully you picked up on in the book. Journalists have read my work. I've written for the popular press. I've also done a lot of work on documentaries. There's 3 documentaries I was pretty heavily involved in, and another one that I'm working on now. And that's a form of writing, or not writing, but anthropological scholarship that's much broader, and in many ways reaches many more people than ethnography does, ethnography proper, academic writing. So through those forms of involvement, I think I do a better job kind of taking on the problematic aspects of journalistic representations. But in general, in my publications, I just try to correct them, to show people that their assumptions about these folks are off base, that they're politically problematic, that they're ethically problematic. And there are other issues I could go into, but I think I'll talk about them later in terms of material compensation. Journalists are very loath to pay their sources because they feel like it compromises the objectivity of the information they get, and I have the exact opposite position. I think the only way to do the kind of work I do and journalists do across such a deep political, economic, and geopolitical divide is it's on the basis of material reciprocity. So I've worked with journalists to make sure they actually pay COFON people for their help, offer something material to the community, and that's been a very hard thing at times, but it's something I'm committed to. So anyways, question 2, what made you interested in doing fieldwork in the Amazon? Now that's a very tough one because it's an old one. It's actually a story I've told many times, but when I was in high school in suburban Chicago, my parents gave me a copy of Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee about what happened to Native peoples in North America largely in the 1800s. And it just made me tremendously sad at a very, very deep level, and angered. And then I took a course my first year at University of Illinois with Enrique Meyer, a Peruvian scholar of the Andes, about the peoples and cultures of South America. And I learned that many of the same processes that were occurring in North America in the 1800s, and are in many ways still occurring today, have really just been taking hold of Amazonia. And I just had this sense that I wanted to do all I could to make sure the same things that happened here would not happen again in another part of the world. So I actually got interested in anthropology through activism. My first year at Illinois, second year actually, I became president of the Illinois Rainforest Action Group, which is an affiliate of the Rainforest Action Network, coordinated boycotts, did public speaking events, all sorts of direct and indirect actions. And I originally wanted to go into anthropology in graduate school to do sustainable development work, applied work, advocacy work. And then one of my professors said, Mike, that stuff is important, but some of the paradigms on which it's based are problematic, so why not do it in such a way that you can maybe help to rethink those paradigms? So rather than just go into a set mode of doing activist or applied work, stand back and evaluate and do your applied and activist work, but probably not as a job, but something you do on the side as a volunteer. And I have been paid a little bit for doing applied work, mainly when I was in graduate school, but not since then. So that's how I got interested in anthropology. It was that moment in high school and that first moment at the University of Illinois when I learned about the political and environmental problems that indigenous South American people were facing. I also think it was a really emotional time for me. I had a very rough first year at Illinois, and all that great existential angst and stuff like that, and a lot of kind of depression and anxiety, and learning about a group of people who were so different from me, people in Amazonia. They seemed so different. Had a sense that some of the problems I was suffering with weren't fact or weren't produced directly by being a human, but by living in a certain culture. So the idea that something out there might be radically different and more fulfilling, and at the same time was getting destroyed so we could have hamburgers and nice plywood and oil, seemed just horribly tragic to me. So there was the psychological element to it as well, this search for difference, and a difference that would kind of get me out of my own psychological ruts. I'm not quite sure that's what actually happened. People aren't as different in many ways as we think they are, but I think on the whole the work did have a lot of positive psychological effects on me. What's your experience of day-to-day life like in this very toxic, polluted environment? Well, what's interesting about Doreno, and I thought I mentioned this, my first time there in 1998, I was assuming it'd just be a big toxic waste dump, and I get there and there's nothing. I mean, some people seemed sick, people were laughing, they were eating, they were still fishing, they were hunting. So in many ways, life there feels very normal and very routine. And it's only when you have some spectacular occurrence, which are relatively rare, like the oil spill in 2014, or when someone is diagnosed, comes down with and dies from cancer, that you really find yourself reflecting on toxicity. Obviously that happened to me a couple times, as I write about, when I was diagnosed with skin cancer in 2005, and then when I had the swallowing problems and descending necrotizing mediastinitis in 2015, that I began to think much more heavily about toxicity. But aside from that, this is why I use the term and concept of slow violence from Rob Nixon, this English professor and cultural critic. Forms of violence that are so slow and gradual that they're often invisible and unremarked upon, such that what happens to your body and your social relations occurs in such a gradual way that you don't even notice it happening. This is the main way in which I think people living in these toxic environments experience violence and succumb to violence. So in many ways it was just felt normal. And I think I also This might sound stupid or entitled or privileged. I'm not sure which of the above, probably all of them, but I very much wanted to expose myself to the same kinds of conditions that people in Doreno were living in. I didn't bring in bottled water. I swam in the river. And I don't know whether that resulted in health problems or not, but I felt as an anthropologist I should do that. I didn't want to be living in a way that was different from how these people were living, especially because I felt like the problems they were facing were in many ways caused by me and my country, and our thirst for oil, and the fact that none of us can get away from oil. I drive to work every day. Everything we use and eat is made with oil. So if these people have to suffer for our lifestyle, I felt potentially I should have to live that life too, and maybe even suffer because of it. No desire to become a martyr. Didn't want to get sick. But I also felt like it was an important part for me ethically in terms of my research relationship with COFON people in Doreno. Number 4, how do you negotiate maintaining the intimacy of your long-standing relationships with the demands of your professional writing? In other words, the weirdness about writing about people you are close to. That is a really tough question. That's something I really try to grapple with in the recent paper I wrote and delivered at Western University. First off, I want to say I'm very glad that my portrayals of people like Alejandro and Lucia and Roberto came off as intimate, because they are intimate. These people matter a tremendous amount to me in ways that far exceed any academic interests I have. They're true friends. My life would be radically different if these people weren't in it. I hope it's very clear in the book that I actually like them. I like being down there. They're incredibly funny, sweet, gifted people. So the intimacy it's a tough one. Obviously I try not to reveal too much about these folks, especially I don't want to air dirty laundry, or got to be very careful about that. But at the same time, I want people to know how complicated these folks are. They're humans just like us in many ways. But they're also extremely impressive in terms of their knowledge, their resilience, their adaptability, all of that. And I want that to come across, at the same time letting people know, the readers, that they're folks just like us. So one of these things that's tough for me is, I think I mentioned in the book, it is an exploitative relationship. I have built a career by publishing works on a group of people who've been mercilessly exploited for 500 years. And this probably gets into the next question, the structural inequalities of the work. There are many ways in which I try to deal with that. In terms of the exploitation, just on my material resources make me very different from these people, and their material resources I've gained in many ways from working with them. I think, as I say in the book, no matter how much I consider folks in Doreno friends and they consider me to be a friend, I can travel to Ecuador in the summer to spend time with them in their homes. They cannot do the same for me unless I pay for it. So there is a fundamental inequality at the heart of our relationship. But even outside of that, or even with that, I do feel it's something extremely personal that matters a tremendous amount to me, and truthfully, as soon as they no longer find satisfaction with our relationship, they can end it. They could very easily prohibit me from entering their communities. They could denounce me to their ethnic federation. They could even, there are people who speak Spanish well enough that could contact my institution review board in San Antonio at UTSA and say, hey, Mike's engaging in problematic work here. So every time I start a project, I always spend at least a month in a community just talking to people about things that interest me, that I'd like to work on, hear what they have to feel, how they feel about that, and then what do they hope to get out of it. So they say, yeah, we're interested in working with you, as long as A, B, and C occur. And I think it's incredibly dehumanizing to assume that I'm fooling these people, that they can't make their own choices, that they don't critically weigh the benefits and risks of any proposed project, any proposed collaboration. They very much do. These aren't stupid people. They've worked with plenty of journalists and anthropologists and other scientists. They're pretty sophisticated actors, and they have the right and I've exercised that right on numerous occasions to say, sorry, we're not interested in working with you. So it's, my relationship with them is based, of course, on my willingness to have this kind of life, which is very fulfilling, but also very demanding, and also induces quite a bit of guilt. But it depends on their willingness to work with me. And if it weren't for that, obviously the relationship could end really, really quickly. One of the things that's a bit hard is that what allows me to go down there is spend time with my friends and my ritual family, and of course do my academic work, is that the only way I can get grants or get promotions is to justify everything I do, all my research and its products, in terms of its intellectual contributions. That's kind of an instrumental relationship with these people. I have to produce knowledge that's of utility for the discipline and not directly a practical utility for them. And that makes it hard because, sorry, I got a phone call here. It makes me feel like our interests don't match or mesh as well as they could. And it also means I can't just go down and hang out when I have nothing to work on as much as I'd like to, because I just don't have the money. I'm not a rich person. I need a paycheck. I need grants. I just don't have the resources to spend all my time down there without doing work that has to be justified in terms of intellectual contributions. So that's rough. In terms of challenging the structural inequalities, strategies I deploy, as I said before, I came to anthropology through activism. I do a lot of joint activist work with COFON people. Of course, I'm the president of the COFON Survival Fund, whose sole mission is to raise funds for the Fundación Sobrevivencia COFON, which is a COFON-controlled Ecuadorian NGO working on environmental, human rights, and sustainable development initiatives. So I spent a lot of time and energy trying to raise funds and get publicity for this organization, for these COFON activists, who've been incredibly successful at basically gaining 1 million acres of territory under some legal agreements for the COFON nation. A lot of people thought these folks would disappear after oil invaded their territory, but they've sprung back, and as long as they have that land, I think they will, as everybody else does, they'll change, but they'll remain what they consider to be COFON people. So I really try as hard as I can to help people out, COFON people out as an activist. Also done a lot of work on land rights campaigns, cultural documentation campaigns, want to create a digital archive of all cultural resources pertaining to COFON people, including all of my ethnographic writings, data, notes, put them in a digital archive that COFON people themselves will be able to access and eventually control. They can't do that right now because they don't have the training or the infrastructure. Computers don't last very long in Amazonian Ecuador. Something that I didn't mention in the book, but that's occurred recently, I've been able to work with 2 students, both COFON community members from Zabalo, a married couple and their daughter, to bring them to University of Texas San Antonio to get their doctorates in anthropology. They'll actually be living with me during the entirety of their educations. I was successful in convincing my colleagues to give them tuition waivers and cover their fees, and then I really hit the streets looking for money to cover their living expenses because they can't take on debt, and got a $100,000 grant to cover their living expenses from the Smith Fund in Chicago. So they're my ritual relatives. It'll be interesting because they're COFON people working on COFON culture, politics, and history with me as their advisor, quote unquote, which is strange because they know much more about COFON life than I do. So they'll be doing work, writing publications that will probably clash with my interpretations in many ways, but that's fine. I think a big part of decolonizing anthropology is to help our collaborators become intellectual and ethnographic authorities, not just research assistants. And if they trouble out our own work or critique it, that's the way anthropology should be. So hopefully they'll succeed, become academics, probably in Ecuador. They really want to run a field school in COFON territory so they can live with their people but still continue to do research. So talk about intimate, ethnography. It's, people who are not only ritual family members to me and great friends, but also students and also people living in my house. So I'd be super psyched. I think Ua Lusitante would be the first indigenous Amazonian person to get a PhD in cultural anthropology from a U.S. university, especially, or at least the first who speaks his native language as his first language. They're interesting because they already got degrees from Brown University, so they're coming with an elite education. They've struggled, but they've done well. So not a lot of COFON students can speak English well enough to get a doctorate. It'll be a struggle. We'll have to work a lot, especially on their writing. But I think it's totally worth it. So the final thing in terms of the inequalities of my work, I just read this great article by Kim Tallbear called Standing With and Speaking as Faith. And it's about the importance of entering research relationships in which we don't have total control over those relationships in which we become invested moral agents, and relationships in which we're willing to be fundamentally altered in terms of our most basic political and intellectual positions. And I have those kind of deep relationships where various COFON people have totally shifted my understanding, shifted the conclusions of my work through some kind of critical intervention. And those relationships, too, have been tried to make them as egalitarian as possible, as long-term as possible, and ones upon which my own professional career depends, and, ones that really determine the shape of my intellectual products and my ability to produce more. As I said before, the only way I can do the work that I do is if COFON people say yes to it. And I don't distort what I write, but it means that I work alongside them. I've trained a number of indigenous COFON students in Ecuador working alongside me on projects. Some of them have been given co-authorship credit, not on my own works, but on some ecological works. So I'm sure I'm forgetting something, but those are some of the ways in which I feel that I've tried to work against the exploitation and the inequality and the hierarchy of anthropological knowledge production, and to really work on joint collaborative kind of activist practice with the people I work with, people I study, my subjects. I always say collaborators, although that sounds like spies or something like that. Colleagues, perhaps, is the best phrase. Finally, material compensation, I mentioned that. I never would expect a COFON person to work on any of my projects unless they were paid. They know that when I come in and I get a grant to do research, I don't write a salary into myself for these grants. I never have. But by doing the research and writing and publishing papers and books, I'm able to keep my job as a professor. So they matter economically to me. And because I recognize that, and COFON people recognize that, they feel like they should get a fair share of the economic resources behind any project. So for the oil project, I got $25,000 in granting funds to do that. More than 19,000 went directly to the people of Doreno, working on with me as research coordinators, assistants, hosts, plus buying a bunch of material goods for the community that they collectively decided on, computers, digital projectors, stuff like that. I'm doing another project right now on shamanism, just starting. I got a grant from the Field Museum and might get a grant from Fulbright, and also one from potentially the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research. The people in the community I work with said, we'd like to be paid $20 an hour for interviews. And I said, sure, I'll write it in. Paying my host family $300 a month, paying research assistants $500 a month, and paying shamans $1,000 a month to help me learn about their practice. Might seem like drops in the bucket to folks in the United States, but these people are extremely poor. I've watched them suffer at home through illnesses when just a little bit of money would take them to the hospital. I've tried to do that when I could, but sometimes I'm not there. So I don't think that's an overcompensation. I'm curious to see what the Wenner-Gren or my IRB will say about paying people $20 an hour for interviews. I think it's fine. I think it's fair. I still think I'm getting, the long end of the stick here. But I really think, as I said before, the only way to build a shared life across these deep political economic inequalities and divides is to share as many resources, to bring as much work. And I think COFON people really appreciate that. I give them an income that they really, really need. And if I didn't, they'd have no interest in working with me as an academic. They'd probably still enjoy my friendship. But I like being able to give people money that they can use to survive. And they like it too. So anyways, in general, I think, people enjoy my presence down there. Unlike many other academics, I said I'd come back every year, and I always have. I said I'd bring back all my publications, and I always have. I live as they do. I have a tremendous respect and admiration for their knowledge. And we become very, very close. So anyways, I hope that answered some of your questions. Feel free to write or to me if you have any further questions. And maybe I'll send you all this paper that I wrote about the ethics and politics of my work. I'm thinking about working it up into some publication, but it's a weird kind of paper. So anyways, I'm not even going to watch this before I upload it to YouTube. So if there's anything damning in it, please let me know. Let me see. And there we go, photo booth. 26.5 minutes. All right, hope you enjoyed, and thanks for reading the book. Bye-bye.